The Atbai Desert, stretching between the Nubian Nile and the Red Sea, has a deep and impressive history, especially during the African Humid Period thousands of years ago when the area wasn't a desert at all. But because of its harsh terrain and remote location, the region has remained largely unexplored by archaeologists. Now, a new study published in the African Archaeological Review is offering new insights into this slightly forgotten landscape. Using satellite remote sensing, researchers have identified hundreds of monumental burial enclosures built by nomadic pastoralists between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago. The discovery adds a helpful new layer to the region's archaeological record, which until now has been known mostly through pottery fragments and ancient rock art. Why were nomadic pastoralists investing so much time and energy in building these huge monuments? Why did they bury humans and cattle alongside one another? And what relationship did these nomadic groups have with the Nile Valley? The prehistoric chronology of the Atbai has gradually been pieced together through limited archaeological research across this desert region. Distinctive pottery traditions, particularly rocket-impressed and pivoting stamp decorations closely related to styles found along the Nubian Nile, defined the Mesolithic and early Neolithic. Although few securely dated pottery finds exist from the later 5th to the 4th millennium BCE, researchers have reconstructed much of this period through surviving rock art. This figure comes from a 2023 paper on the rock art of the Atbai Desert, which, as well as lots of cattle motifs, includes carvings of boats. The people of the Atbai primarily relied on cattle pastoralism for survival. However, as the African Humid Period drew to a close and the region became increasingly arid, many communities either migrated towards fertile lands or adapted by herding more mobile animals such as goats and sheep. The discovery of more and more monumental burial enclosures has become a major breakthrough in understanding the prehistoric communities that lived there. The story of the Atbai is tied to the rise and collapse of the African Humid Period, a time when much of what is now desert was once far greener and more habitable. Around 7,300 years ago, rainfall across the region began to steadily retreat at a rate of roughly 35 kilometers per century. But the impacts on the environment of this transformation in climate were not that simple or uniform. Even as the region became drier, groundwater sources and human land use appear to have slowed the spread of desert conditions, allowing pockets of vegetation and pastoral life to survive far longer than we might expect. For the communities of the Atbai, adapting to this gradual environmental change became an important part of their story, because much of their monumental activity continued into this period. Since the early 20th century, archaeologists have uncovered a handful of Atbai enclosure burials, or AEBs as they are often referred to. But for decades, their true scale and importance to pastoralist communities have been largely overlooked. One of the first sites ever identified was at Behaviour, where 3 interconnected circular burial monuments were discovered. Early, limited excavations revealed cattle bones inside these structures. Pottery found at the site was initially linked to Nubian sea group ware, suggesting a date between 2400 and 1550 BCE. But more recent discoveries resemble late pre-Kerma wares instead, which are significantly older and date to around 3000 to 2500 BCE. This conflicting evidence makes Bir Asel difficult to date with certainty, though many researchers now believe the monument was originally constructed much earlier, before being reused by later generations. A few years ago, a Polish archaeological expedition excavated one of the most impressive Atbai enclosure burials ever discovered at Wadi Kashab, east of Kom Ombo. There, the team uncovered a massive circular structure measuring 18 meters across and enclosed by a low stone wall. Inside there were 25 burials containing both humans and animals. These burials were centered on one human interment. Radiocarbon dates showed that the burials had been carried out in different stages during the 5th and 4th millennia BCE. The monument had then been reused in the 2nd millennium, when an upright monolithic stele was erected and the interior structure was filled with rubble. Ceramics discovered at Wadi Kashab were associated with this later phase of reuse and resembled Middle Nubian pottery from the C group horizon. This means that the initial construction of the monument did not correspond with any established cultural horizons from the Egyptian and Nubian Nile in the 4th millennium BCE. The research group CERDO carried out a partial excavation of a similar structure at Wadi el-Ku in the Sudanese Atbai. There they found cattle and sheep bones and were able to radiocarbon date it to the 4th millennium BCE. The same group have done several other excavations of these types of enclosures, but overall only 2 Atbai enclosure burials have been radiocarbon dated, those at Wadi Kashab and Wadi el-Ku, and they position this practice within the mid-Holocene and the African Humid Period. Other yet unpublished work at other sites supports these dates. Several excavations have been carried out at another type of burial structure in the Atbai Desert. These monuments are made up of small burial pits enclosed by a small ring superstructure. Diagnostic pottery and radiocarbon testing dates these smaller monuments to the 5th millennium BCE, predating the larger structures. This indicates an earlier burial tradition in the Atbai that possibly continued alongside the creation of the larger monuments later on. Aside from the limited excavations of burial monuments in the Atbai, ground surveys and remote sensing investigations have identified other features that are likely large circular enclosures. However, the new study has taken this to the next level. The Atbai Survey Project, started in September 2024, has been using remote sensing to identify structures related to the heritage of the Sudanese Atbai Desert. Overall, 280 Atbai enclosure burials have been identified across the region, including 20 structures that were already known from fieldwork. This means that 260 new monuments have been discovered using this technique. The northernmost feature is the well-excavated enclosure at Wadi Kashab near Kom Ombo in Egypt, and the southernmost example is in Eritrea at Khor Baraka. The typologies of the monuments vary considerably. Their diameters range from 5 to 82 meters. It's difficult to categorize the monuments into typologies without excavations, since certain features are unknown, such as whether they were used for human or animal burials and their date. However, the researchers decided to categorize them based on what they do know from remote sensing. They looked at whether they are circular or ovoid, how thick their walls are, whether they have internal tumuli, and whether they have entrances. No geographical or cultural clusters of certain types could be identified. However, it might be that the style of monuments changed over time, so the variations seen in remote sensing relate to typologies over a long chronological period. The most common type of monument is type B, which has no entrance and varying configurations of internal tumuli. However, internal features may date to later reuses of the monuments. In terms of the geographic distribution of the monuments, they covered the entire Atbai. Only a few sites were found in the flatter deserts next to the Nile Valley. The Atbai enclosure burial tradition is very much defined by the Atbai Desert or East Nubia. That is, unless many more such monuments were built in the Nile Valley and simply didn't survive. In these figures, southeast Upper Egypt is shown in A, the Gabgaba region is shown in B, and the central Atbai is shown in C. Yellow circles are Atbai enclosure burials, blue stars are watering points, and the red dots are later burials. The greatest concentration of these monuments is west of the Red Sea Hills, especially the upper Wadi Gabgaba basin, where 112 examples were identified. Topographically, the monuments are all sited at the base of mountains and on plateaus, mostly along wadi systems which would have provided water. A small number of similar burial complexes have also been discovered in the past along the Nile Valley, hinting at deeper connections between desert pastoralists and the sedentary world of ancient Egypt and Nubia. One example was investigated by the Aswan Kom Ombo Archaeological project on the west bank of the Nile north of Aswan. Unfortunately, the site had been heavily looted long before archaeologists arrived, leaving human and animal remains scattered across the area and making interpretation difficult. Even so, the structure appears to have been an enclosure burial linked to a nomadic pastoral community. Pottery recovered from the site included both Egyptian and Nubian wares dating to the second half of the 4th millennium BCE. Two more comparable burial features were later identified in the Rayana Desert near Luxor. Another important example came from Armant, close to Luxor, where archaeologists uncovered a structure within a Nubian-related elite nomadic cemetery. Pottery dates the site to the early 3rd millennium BCE, and its internal layout closely resembles the enclosure burial at Wadi Kashab. Clusters of cattle burials were found surrounding human graves, reinforcing the close ritual relationship between people and livestock in these communities. Mixed human and animal burials have also been identified in several other Nubian cemeteries, although unlike the Atbai examples, these Nile Valley sites generally lack large stone architecture. This raises intriguing possibilities. Perhaps these monuments reflect a blending of Nile Valley and desert traditions, or maybe they mark the presence of pastoralist groups living in an enclave along the river. During the time when the Egyptian state was first emerging, these burial sites may reveal strong cultural and economic ties between the settled communities of the Nile and the nomadic peoples of the surrounding deserts. Archaeologists often use the term cattle-centered behaviour to describe just how important cattle were to the pastoralist societies of the Eastern Sahara during the Middle and Late Holocene. For these communities, cattle were far more than a food source or a measure of wealth. They played a central role in social identity, ritual life, and belief systems. Evidence of this can be seen repeatedly in both rock art and burial practices across the region. One of the earliest known examples comes from Nabta Playa, the famous predynastic site known for its stone circle, where cattle remains were deliberately placed in a funerary context. This is the earliest evidence of a cattle burial yet discovered in northeastern Africa. Over time, the practice became especially common in Nubia during the 4th millennium BCE, where cattle inhumations frequently accompanied human burials, highlighting the symbolic bond between people and their herds. Without more extensive excavations of the hundreds of burial monuments scattered across the Atbai Desert, it's impossible to say with certainty exactly what or who lies within them. However, the 3 excavated examples all contained cattle remains, strongly suggesting a link to Nubian pastoral communities. Just as in well-studied Nubian cemeteries, cattle likely played a central role in social and ritual life. Supporting this interpretation, satellite imagery surveys have also revealed additional traces of pastoral activity in the landscape, including ancient water sources and networks of pastoral tracks. Together, these pieces of evidence point to a once active landscape shaped by mobile herding communities moving through and inhabiting the Atbai. Overall, it seems that these prehistoric pastoral communities constructed funerary monuments as socially significant places rather than simple burial sites. The effort required to build them, often at the expense of everyday subsistence activities, likely helped strengthen social bonds within each group. In many cases, a central or focal burial appears to be surrounded by others, suggesting a possible hierarchy and the presence of a prominent individual within the community. Similar patterns have been suggested by other researchers studying Saharan burial traditions, where emerging social differentiation is increasingly being recognized. From the late 5th to the early 3rd millennium BCE, while these monumental burials were being built across the Atbai, ancient Egypt was itself undergoing a huge transformation. This was the era of the Badarian and Naqada cultures, the pre-dynastic societies that laid the groundwork for the pharaonic civilization, eventually leading to the early dynastic period and the rise of the Old Kingdom. At the same time, neighboring regions were also experiencing cultural development, including the Akban A group and pre-Kerma cultures in Nubia, as well as the Bhutana group further south. Rather than isolated cultures, these groups represent regional expressions of broader nomadic and semi-nomadic traditions across the Nile Valley and the Eastern Sahara. The Atbai Enclosure monuments belong to this wider cultural horizon and reflect the lives of pastoralists moving between the Nile and the Red Sea. These communities herded cattle, goats, and sheep and expressed wealth, identity, and social status through ritual practices and monument building. Among them, cattle held a powerful ceremonial and symbolic role central to both life and death. So what do you think? Do you think these monuments show social hierarchy among ancient pastoralists, or are the researchers reading too much into this? I'd like to hear what you say, so let's continue this conversation in the comments. It also helps the algorithm. If you want to read the paper in its entirety, it's open access and referenced in the description below. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.